Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do a review of sorts of this book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. This book was suggested to me way back in November by a viewer of my video about reading history in Nonfiction November, and she challenged the fact that I didn't have any books written by women about non-white men, and when I look back at my list, she was exactly right, and this is one of the books she suggested. I can't really do the book, I don't think, full justice by trying to go through and talk about every idea that's in the book. So I just picked 5 things that I think are valuable lessons or valuable things in the book that the book does that I haven't seen done in lots of other places. So I'm just going to go through them 1 through 5, and these are more or less chronological points that I'm making as well. So point number 1 is a point that probably students of American history or of colonial American history in general probably are aware of, and that is that there were sophisticated and advanced civilizations in existence in the Americas long before Columbus blundered his way into the Americas and long before colonization of the Americas by any European power. Not just, though, the ones that we think about, the Aztecs, the Olmec, the Inca, the Maya, but also these same civilizations or advanced civilizations existed in North America as well, with civilizations like the Anasazi or the ancient Hopi civilization, Cahokia, the mound building Indians of the Mississippi River and its tributary areas, and then the Native American cultures of the Northeast, the lodge-building Native Americans. Whether we consider them part of what we refer to as the Iroquois Confederacy or the Powhatan Confederacy that the Jamestown colonists run into, or the Wampanoag civilization that the Pilgrims ran into, that these civilizations practiced a sophisticated matrilineal society and with rules and laws, who had sophisticated farming techniques that they used to sustain themselves and to sustain their communities and civilizations, but that also cultivated their forests to eliminate undergrowth so that they could cultivate herds of animals, herds being the wrong term, but cultivate the population of animals upon which they also depended, that these were very sophisticated civilizations. And one of the things that she pointed out was that the forested areas along the eastern coast of the United States, there wasn't a lot of undergrowth, that it was almost park-like, with a canopy of trees overhead. And I'd always thought this was just a byproduct of, the trees above being so tall and so overarching that they prevented sunlight or a lot of sunlight from reaching the ground, and therefore undergrowth couldn't really grow. But she argues effectively that this was actually on purpose so that Native American hunters could at once sustain deer and other populations that they depended on and still have sight lines for hunting, and hunting could be made easier by this. Her second point, and this is one that she follows throughout the book, is that no matter where we're talking about European colonists in the Americas, even though she does focus on the English colonists in North America, no matter where they landed or what their intention in coming was, that they were, in effect, imperialists, that they were colonial settlers, that they were, settler conquerors, that they were playing out a part in European imperialism, and that no matter what their intentions were, no matter what their values were, no matter what their purpose in forming those colonies were, that they formed those colonies and saw Native Americans as an obstacle. Native Americans as an obstacle to be removed, and therefore all English colonial groups practiced violence against Native Americans, which, as we'll see in the next point, took on genocidal overtones. That what they believed in was the doctrine of discovery, in a sense that they felt they discovered this territory. In a grand sense, England claiming the territory, but also just the colonists themselves feeling like they discovered the territory and therefore they had right to it. And this, inherently means that they did not respect the indigenous cultures they found, that they felt that those cultures were beneath them, were barbaric, and therefore were worthy of being eliminated. Point number 3 was that the colonial frontier, wherever it was, whether it was the Appalachian Mountains or the Great Plains or Northern California, or wherever, or Texas, wherever the colonial frontier was, and again, keeping in mind she's thinking of Americans even after the American Revolution as colonial settlers, that she's not just thinking about the 13 colonies, but post-American Revolution, post-independence, she's still thinking about and talking about, and I think compellingly labeling American settlers moving west as colonial settlers. That those colonial settlers and that frontier is essentially the edge of genocide. That the settlers along that frontier attacked Native Americans, they attacked men, women, and children, they intentionally destroyed food, they remove, they resettle, they enter into treaties which they then break. Our Native Americans are being pressured by American colonists who are coming for their land specifically, and that they developed a specific style of warfare which she refers to as ranger warfare, in which these irregular American forces, militarized colonists, then carry out this genocide intentionally. Point number 4 is that many of the heroes and the myths and the ideas that we have about American history and American historical destiny are just that, and that many of our heroes were actually participants, knowing participants in genocide or cheerleaders for that genocide. One of the groups that comes in for the harshest criticism are the Scotch-Irish. My family history follows this pattern that the Scotch-Irish were willing participants in pushing this colonial frontier and attacking Native Americans and in fighting this genocidal war. That, obvious things like manifest destiny and this idea of American progress only being possible after we eliminated the influence and took the land from indigenous populations. That this may, a lot of times people think, oh, well, this is regrettable, but it's what had to happen. That she argues that wasn't that inevitable and that it didn't necessarily have to happen. She doesn't spare literary types. James Fenimore Cooper is roundly criticized for his creation of this kind of making a hero out of the American frontiersman. And not making him, as she sees him, a person bent on genocide of Native Americans. She criticizes heavily Walt Whitman for cheerleading for the Mexican-American War and cheerleading the destruction and removal of Native Americans. Some American heroes who you may be aware of were involved in this. She also criticizes, like William Tecumseh Sherman, the American general after Civil War, who's more or less in charge of Native American policy in the West and in the Great Plains, obviously comes in for criticism, as does Andrew Jackson, well-deserved criticism of all the American presidents, by the way, who least deserve a statue or to have their face on money. Jackson is just a wretched example of exactly what she's talking about, and our continued tolerance of him as some kind of an American hero is really untenable. But also she goes after Daniel Boone and Zebulon Pike and Davy Crockett and other kind of heroes. When we think back on it, we think about these people moving west and discovering and expanding the United States, and we talk about it as a positive, as though there was not an alternative. And she argues that not only was there an alternative, but that these people knew it and they carried out genocide anyway. And then point number 5 I wanted to mention is one of the things I think is the most compelling part of her argument, and she argues that the United States military developed part of its military style and tactics from these kind of ranger warfare, these irregular rangers practicing a genocidal war along the American frontier. It's her claim that that's where we learn the idea for total warfare, that's where the idea of attacks on civilians as a way to carry out the mission of the United States military comes from. That this began, during the colonial period with George Rogers Clark and others moving west and attacking Native Americans under the guise of the American Revolution. But really it was a war for land. She discusses this in terms of the Texas Rangers, whose very name carries that word, ranger, and that these were essentially irregular warriors fighting against Native Americans and attempting to kill, remove them, displace them, a genocidal war there. Sherman's concept of total war, which he uses against the American Confederacy during the Civil War, she says, has its roots in this style of war. The methods used by the United States military to try to, and to successfully quell and crush the Philippine Revolution in the decade after the Philippines became a colony, she says, is a form of this, and she even relates this to the American style of warfare in Vietnam with its search and destroy missions as, being a form of this kind of genocidal total warfare. She also brings up something really interesting, and I've heard this term, for as long as I can remember, particularly in regard to Vietnam, that Vietnam soldiers refer to being in Vietnam, outside the cities of Vietnam, as being in country. And I just thought this meant you were, in enemy territory, that you were outside of the cities, that you were literally in the country. And she argues that the term actually comes from Indian country, being an Indian country, and that term carries with it the concept that there are essentially no rules. So my overall impression of this book, of an Indigenous people's history of the United States, is that it's a good book, and it does, I think, a great historical service. It challenges our accepted wisdom. It challenges our conventional notion of American history. It challenges some of the myths we have about American progress and American greatness, and it kind of forces us to deal with the truth of genocide against indigenous peoples and Native Americans in the United States, that was a part of what we were doing, and it wasn't incidental, that it was the heart and soul of what the conquest and the settlement of the United States of America was really all about, and that it's been there from the very beginning. So I do have one criticism, or really two criticisms of the book. Number one, it's somewhat repetitive. It feels like near the end of the book that she has said what she wants to say, and she is insisting on making a political point about the current situation in the United States by constantly going back and tying this into the past. It's not that I think that she's wrong necessarily, but I think that she made that point. And then the other thing I would just point out about the book is I think that Dunbar-Ortiz very carefully cultivates her sources. This is not academic dishonesty, and interestingly, Mark Nash and I had a discussion recently about what history is supposed to be, how history is supposed to be done, how university professors approach how history is supposed to be done, and what I'm about to say reminded me of that discussion. So when I say she cultivates her sources, what I mean is that she has a tendency to build up or grow certain sources and use them frequently, and perhaps stretch the limits of their use to support her argument, and at the same time she has a tendency to prune or to weed some of her sources, and to weed perhaps the context in which some of the things that she cites were said or meant. This doesn't invalidate her book as a work of history. If anything, I think it enlivens it, because it should invite an academic response. It should invite challenges to what she said, and is it actually supportable? And that really is, to me, what history should be, a continual argument about what actually happened and what it means. That's how we learn from history, not just from repeating the same things over and over again, not just from accepting conventional wisdom. And to be honest with you, no matter how much history you should always have those ideas challenged. Anyway, there's my review of An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, which I thought was a good book. And I hope more people will read it, because I think it will invite that discussion. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments section. As always, thank you for watching.